Good day, everyone. This is Melinda Gertz. I'm the Vice President of Operations with DAC Patient Recruitment Services, and thank you very much for joining us today for the webinar series that's being hosted by Imperial Clinical Research Support Organization. Today's webinar is entitled Best Practices and Common Pitfalls to Avoid in Planning and Conducting Global Trials. The primary focus of this webinar is going to be on site feasibility, regulatory considerations, site selection, and patient recruitment. For the question and answer section, we are going to use the chat feature of the meeting. So you'll see in the lower right-hand corner of your control panel, you'll see the chat feature down there. So I would welcome you throughout the presentation. If you have any questions for the presenters, for Dan or Gwen, please feel free to include that in the chat section. And at the end of the presentation, we'll set aside time to get those questions answered. So with that, I would like to introduce today's speakers. With us today, we have Dan McDonald, the Director of Business Development for DAC Patient Recruitment Services, and joining him is Gwen Welty, the Director of Project Operations. DAC works from DAC's Boston office, and he is responsible for identifying new opportunities, building strategic partnerships, and managing contract negotiations. Dan recently rejoined DAC in 2013, and he has previously served in the area of strategic and business development for DAC. He has authored many articles for industry publications, and he is also a popular presenter at industry conferences and has conducted numerous workshops on patient recruitment for clinical trials. Gwen is responsible for identifying new business opportunities as well, and building strategic partnerships and managing existing clients. As a seasoned biopharmaceutical professional, she brings more than 16 years of regulatory, preclinical, clinical, and sales experience to the DAC team. Before we get started, Dan, Gwen, are there any other opening comments you'd like to make to the attendees today?
Well, thank you for that warm introduction, first and foremost, Melinda, and certainly thanks to everyone who's taken time out of their busy schedules to join us today to learn more about some of the best practices and common pitfalls to avoid when planning and conducting global trials. We certainly appreciate your time and hope that you get something useful and some truly actionable tips from us during the course of our presentation. I just had a few comments before we get into the slides, perhaps a little stage setting, if you will. What I'd like to say is, I guess at a high level, the challenges that we're facing as a biopharmaceutical industry and certainly you as biopharmaceutical companies and clinical trial sponsors in the process that you face when you're bringing your new compounds from bench to bedside are certainly vast and well documented at this point. But I think that the resulting shift we're seeing and we're all experiencing as we move from what is really a well-known domestic drug development policy to a global one now with many variables is probably keeping many of you up nights as you try to figure out how to navigate this new landscape. And I'd also like to say that the change that the industry has faced really in a relatively short time period, if you think about it, it's maybe 15 to 20 years, has been unprecedented. That change has certainly led to landmines that we have to navigate and pitfalls and things to avoid, but it's also uncovered gold mines for the industry. There's a larger and more diverse patient pool of patients available to volunteer for studies and ensure better genetic diversification in our programs. There's certainly a broader base of medical expertise to leverage in terms of using physicians across the world. And I'd say last but not least, conduct of trials in other countries opens up the opportunity to then market those products or our products in those countries in future years. And in fact, really a growing number of countries are requiring that type of commitment, the commitment to market your product in those countries from U.S. study sponsors as a condition for granting approvals to conduct trials in their country. So that's just a little bit of stage setting. And now if Melinda could advance the slides, I want to talk a little bit about what's happening with global clinical trials. And frankly, it's a big world out there. Not many companies have conducted a sort of a country-by-country comparison as is done here. This is by the well-known consulting firm A.T. Kearney, which is a global research and consulting firm, and this was done a few years back. And essentially what they've done here is they've used the USA as the benchmark and then compared countries against it. And they included factors such as the patient pool, cost efficiency, regulatory conditions, relevant expertise, and the infrastructure and environment in those countries. This has evolved a little bit, I'd say. This is probably a couple years old now, but I think it still remains relatively accurate. I'd say India probably has fallen off here due to some of the recent regulatory challenges that they're facing, and I know that Brazil has fallen out of favor with some companies because of how long it takes to get regulatory approval. But outside of that, most of this should remain fairly accurate. But when you really look at the various factors considered, it's really not hard to notice that patient pool favors most significantly into the calculation. And the fact is, if we can't find enough patients willing to participate in our trials, we certainly can't advance new treatments. If we go to the next slide, we'll just dive in a little bit deeper with regards to the country index that I just shared with you. So this is how A.T. Kearney broke out their analysis through the discussions they had with sponsor representatives. And you can see the different percentages they've allotted to each category, basically the way they weighted each category. And patient pool favors in the most at 30%. Then tied for second are cost efficiency and regulatory conditions. And then tied for third were relevant expertise, and then the infrastructure and the environment presented in that country. There are also, I know, a few think tanks and market research firms out there that are looking at doing something like this, but more in sort of a black box fashion, where sponsors and CROs can submit their actual timelines for specific types of studies in certain countries for the industry to use as benchmarking, a benchmarking tool for planning purposes for global trials. And I think that's something that's really missing right now. For us to have actual data on really how long does it take to get a regulatory approval in a particular country? What was your experience with getting ethics committee approvals? How long did it take to contract the sites, to get sites up to speed? These are all things that if we had good data on industry-wide could be invaluable in helping to plan our global programs. So as we go on to the next slide, and as we sort of push outward and forward, we naturally assume more risk with our studies. We've really all heard the horror stories over the years, and from minor to major and really everything in between. There's enough of them out there that some companies without immediate commercialization goals outside the U.S. decide to simply conduct their trials here. Certainly taking maybe more time and costing a lot more, but with far less risk in their eyes. But I would say for many companies, especially the small to mid-sized biopharmaceutical companies, the economic climate is so bad that they must look outside the U.S. in order to conduct studies that fit within their limited budgets. If we also look at larger companies, they're also dealing with a changing environment. They've certainly got an insatiable investor community that's demanding them to drive sales growth. And so hence, they too are going elsewhere and everywhere as they look for new markets for which to market their products. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll get into starting to talk about, I guess, some of the risks that we're facing as we move forward with our plans to conduct global trials. And here's really where we'll talk a little bit about Murphy's Law. What can go wrong will go wrong without prior planning. Proper planning of our studies is really such a critical factor to our success, but it's often one of the most rushed aspects of study management. Here are some of the challenges we've seen and that we hear about most often when speaking to sponsors. And I'm not going to go and read through every single one of these, but certainly if you've been involved in the planning and conduct of global trials over the years, these are all familiar to you. Call them landmines, pitfalls, or risks, but the goal relatively remains the same: avoid them at all costs. So we're going to be zooming in on some of the most common ones that we've experienced as part of our talk today. But let's be frank, these are not truth specific to conducting trials outside of the U.S. These are what I would call just universal truths when running trials in general. But while they may be hurdles in a domestic study, they can be study killers when that study is happening many thousands of miles away. So these are just some of the things that I guess we risk as we prepare and execute our global trials. And now we're going to spend some time doing a deeper dive into some of the more common challenges. And I would just say that this is not an exhaustive list, but instead is really focused on those issues which most commonly impact the timelines of the study and our abilities to successfully enroll the study on time and on budget. So if we go to the next slide, we'll step very gingerly into our first pitfall, which is talking about the study feasibility and planning process. I don't think there's any issue that I hear about more from investigators than protocol design. The successful planning of our studies starts with protocol design. Protocol design certainly determines the accessibility of the target population. And oftentimes sponsors are in a position where they either can't think as flexibly as they'd like to about protocol design because perhaps feedback and pressure from the FDA, but also they don't often have the opportunity or perhaps think as much as they should about recruitment or retention challenges during the protocol and design development phase. But certainly considering potential enrollment and attrition obstacles could limit the need for protocol amendments and or addition of more sites down the line. So there's a number of different challenges that come up during the study feasibility and planning process, and I won't speak to every one of these, but I'll highlight a few of them. Certainly analyzing disease prevalence and incidence is one of the biggest challenges with global studies. Unlike here in the U.S., where we might be able to tap into databases like insurance claims and other types of information that data aggregators have put together for us, when we look at the global landscape, it's much harder for us to really analyze disease prevalence. There are organizations like the World Health Organization who have aggregated some data on disease prevalence. There are certainly health associations and patient advocacy groups and non-government organizations that have aggregated data on disease prevalence. We often look to medical journals and studies that have been done looking at prevalence, but those are sometimes segmented into a particular patient population, whether it be by region or ethnicity. So it's hard to kind of develop an aggregate or wide-ranging estimate about the population that exists. So that's where it really becomes critical to filter your enrollment projections through local representatives. Not only the sites that you're considering for the study, and through the feasibility analysis you might do and the questionnaire you might send to them, but also any local representatives like therapeutic area experts that are based in that country, other investigators that have conducted similar types of trials in the past that might not be part of your program but might be able to weigh in objectively and candidly about your study and whether those patients truly exist in that country. Understanding things like the standard of care and the presentation of disease, this can really differ from country to country, and it's important to factor that in. And then also, one thing we always talk about and we'll say as we move through this presentation is building in buffers for unexpected time and cost. Certainly, what we see mistakes sponsors make on some of the programs that we manage and CROs as well is really creating timelines that are just too tight and don't leave some room for unexpected events, which are often the norm, unfortunately, when it comes to global trials. And last but not least, when it comes to the protocol, I think we've all probably sat in on investigator meetings where the first site initiation visit is 2 weeks off, yet you're sitting in the meeting and the investigators are tearing apart the protocol, and there ends up being amendments to it and changes, and you're already facing delays before you've really even gotten your study started. So we would recommend a very thorough vetting process of the protocol before you move forward with your program, and we bulleted out here some of the different parties that we would suggest you get involved during that review process to make sure that as best as possible that protocol is really finalized before moving forward with your study. So we can move on to the next slide, which really ties into what we just talked about, the importance of vetting your protocol before moving forward with your regulatory submissions is another critical element of trying to be as successful as possible with your global program. So our pitfall number 2 has to do with regulatory submissions. And this is certainly one of the pitfalls which often has the most adverse impact on study timelines. We've all heard stories of country-specific regulatory approvals which never happen, or happen so late that it doesn't make sense to initiate the sites. And there are really huge ramifications that can take place with these delays on out-of-pocket costs for running the trial, and certainly opportunity costs with each day of delay. So there are a number of best practices which can be followed to try to address this issue. First, really what project is ever successful without a well-thought plan? Developing a strategic regulatory plan with steps and timelines is critical, and it's smart. Things like which countries will you submit your applications in first? How long will the review process take? What about ethics committee review? What is that process like, and how long will that take? We would recommend really mapping it all out on a Gantt chart or something similar, and then building in the buffers, as I mentioned before, because regulatory, frankly, is part art and part science, and from our experience, things really go as planned. Staggering your submissions, or at least not holding off on submissions, which will take the longest time to get an approval, is critical. You really don't want, for example, 25% of your patients to come from a country that's going to take 9 months to get a regulatory approval, and then you go and submit that application last. So it's really important that you think about the timelines and the process and timelines around when you're going to be submitting your applications into various countries, and sort of trying to think ahead and plan that out properly. Last but not least, major changes cause major delays. So as we mentioned before, if you can really try to finalize the protocol before your submission as much as possible, that's going to help you. If you later want to go back and make edits to that, in many countries you're going to run into problems, because it's going to ultimately require amendments to be submitted, and often your application will fall back to the bottom of the pile. So you really want to try to avoid that. And one of the things related to really patient recruitment and even site selection is apply for more patients and sites than needed. This is something that we always recommend, because frankly, if you have to apply for more sites later on, or try to add patients to the program later on in that country, it's often going to require an amendment, and that's going to set you back as well. So the next pitfall that we'll address is the fact that there's a tremendous amount of local analysis that needs to happen. While you may be focused on the overarching global goals of your study, it's really critical to develop localized plans for each country where you will be conducting the study. It's even more important if you don't have experience or personnel in that region. Then you really have to consider the importance of partnering with somebody who does. Don't underestimate how important it is to have true local expertise. I mean, certainly if you can't have feet on the street from your own company, we would recommend that you make sure the company that you're using really knows that market and it has experience supporting studies there. There are a number of major considerations that we've outlined on this slide that we would urge you to consider, and some of these are clear and obvious ones. But then there's a lot of gray area and nuance that comes into effect when it comes to selecting countries and really looking at the local landscape. And these often can be gained only through having previous experience working in that location. So even if you're confident of a significant number of protocol matching patients, you really have to consider many other factors, things like logistics. You might want to consider how close sites are to major airports and transportation routes. Can the study monitors get in and out easy? Things like getting your study drug into that country, getting samples out of the country if you have a central lab located elsewhere. These are all types of things that you need to take into consideration. Would also certainly recommend considering language. In many countries, the investigator and the study site speak English, but sometimes study documentation may still need to be translated for regulatory authorities or ethics committees. And most certainly anything patient-facing often needs to be translated. So you have to consider that as well. Will you have translations done locally? Will they be done centrally? How long will that process take? And are those translations going to be something that is accurate, you can stand behind, and are culturally acceptable? You also want to consider things like religion and cultural and socioeconomic realities. These all can create complications. They may have an impact on things like the diet of patients, or what holidays does the country shut down for. Do the requirements of your study relate directly to the socioeconomic status of the patient, for example? Does the state insurance or patient cover certain healthcare costs? So these are all things you want to take into consideration, and they're things that we'll talk about in a case study that we'll present later on in this presentation. It really calls or brings to light how some of those particular elements can directly impact your ability to be successful recruiting patients for a study. And so now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Gwen Welty, who has a tremendous amount of experience with site management, site selection and identification on global studies, and she's going to share some of her expertise with you as she walks through some of the other pitfalls that we've identified. Over to you, Gwen.
Thank you, Dan. It's good to have you with us today. I noticed that many of the attendees are coming from sponsor organizations or CROs, and we certainly thank you and welcome you to this webcast. Also, we saw there's a few sites that have actually called in, and so, we do welcome your feedback as well at the end of this presentation. Please do enter in your questions, as Melinda indicated, as we would love to hear your perspectives on this as well. So when we think about site feasibility and potential pitfalls with those, there's really two reasons why. First of all, we even conduct site feasibility, and one is for good clinical practice or GCP compliance. And as you know, that includes your local and your national and international regulations and statutes, and to really ensure that the sites that you're looking at are adequately trained and knowledgeable to run clinical trials. And then secondly, when you look at sites for feasibility purposes, you really are looking at them for a logistical prediction of their success on a particular study. And you want to make sure that they, of course, have the appropriate patient population first and foremost, but also that they have the personnel that's needed to run the trial, especially if you have maybe weekends or some holiday type visits that might fall within the study, or even very late night visits or early morning visits. Have personnel that can handle those kind of protocol requirements, as well as the protocol-specific equipment. And those are the things that sponsors and CROs alike will look at very early on. And if you don't have that as a site, if you don't have that equipment, then there may be some ways in which, the sponsor can help you get that. The first two bullets on the slide are ones that routinely put clinical teams in a quagmire. And, how do you juggle the participation of key opinion leaders, or if you call them key scientific leaders at your company, while ensuring the right mix of performing sites? That's the question. And where are the best global locations for sites to be for this particular trial? Having a site feasibility advocate participate on a protocol development team is one way to plan for success. And this advocate, in our minds, should be someone who intimately understands, first and foremost, the patient population that's needed for the study, the intricacies of the disease being studied, which includes that incidence and prevalence that Dan referred to earlier, and then also that ideal site profile that would be best to fulfill the enrollment goals. If you don't have a full-time employee on your study team that can fill a similar type role, perhaps considering utilizing or partnering with a vendor such as DAC to provide this type of insight early in the protocol development stage. Sites have expressed to me over the years of working in trial management and ClinOps that they have high frustration levels and fatigue with answering the same questions multiple times. For example, do you have adequate investigational product storage? Well, yes, they still have the same locked cabinets and locked refrigerators and freezers. What is your internet speed and bandwidth? Well, it probably has not gotten slower. Do you have a -70 or a -20 degrees Celsius freezer? These types of questions are asked over and over by study teams at multiple sponsors, and try the patience of the study staff, I think, and that's being generous. It is my recommendation that sponsors consider an annual on-site visit to determine those general overarching type requirements, and then verbally confirm this information during protocol-specific site evaluations. And that's, of course, if your SOPs and your business practices allow. This will save time and minimize that frustration that you feel with clinical research coordinators, I promise. Also, when conducting site feasibility, think through a site's current staffing to study load ratio while projecting to the very best of your ability your start date and conduct timelines. Talk through if and how competing trials will affect your screening and enrollment. This plan of action that you devise while at the site or on the phone with the site personnel, should be documented in a written recruitment plan, which will be discussed in a few moments. As you know, there's no substitute for a highly motivated site. And during the feasibility stage, gauge a site's level of openness for new and fresh recruitment ideas and suggestions. Especially have a game plan for when the site has exhausted the existing patient pool for study recruitment. What's plan B really going to be, and what does it look like? If you find that more than 3 months elapse from the time of site selection to site initiation, consider revisiting at a minimum the timing and competing studies portion of the feasibility exercise with the sites to determine enrollment impact on a particular study. Definitely document this discussion in the recruitment plan, and which will help ensure down the road open communication, and it also lays that expectations for the sponsor and the sites alike very early on in the process. So as we look at the next pitfall, pitfall number 5 is patient recruitment. The most successful sites on clinical studies have a written recruitment plan that is periodically discussed with the sponsor or CRO. And this plan is used as a discussion tool during all stages of the clinical trial, all the way from feasibility, selection, activation, and then even more so perhaps during those interim monitoring visits to determine how a site is performing and how the study team can best support the recruitment and retention efforts. Oftentimes, the information gained from the site discussions of recruitment plans exposes trends at the site that is invaluable for study teams to mitigate early on and even to provide a protocol level fix, for sites who are having trouble that are experiencing the same types of issues. The recruitment plan at a minimum should contain a funnel of the major inclusion-exclusion criteria of the study with a prediction of what percentage of that site's patient population will be affected. Dan's going to speak a little bit more about this in detail as we move through this presentation. With global trials, take into consideration country-specific needs and the differences in standard of care in your recruitment plans. This will allow for more realistic enrollment goals to be set for sites, taking into account your clinical trial authorization and ethics committee approval timelines, as well as the import license timing, depending on if they are submitted in parallel or sequentially. And make sure that your regulatory team members weigh in on that very early so you can really bank on that timing and build that into your timelines up front. Also, as a forecast of each site's expected screening enrollment should appear with weekly forecasts for those studies that have a very short duration, or a monthly and yearly forecast for those studies that are longer term throughout the duration of the trial. Mapping a site's actual enrollment performance over time against the predicted allows for real-time adjustments to be made on both the sponsors and the site's behalf to get the study back on track. The constant exchange of information prohibits that elephant in the room syndrome, if you will, when enrollment is not tracking as expected. If you aren't sure about how to proceed in a particular country or feel that enrollment or retention of patients will be a challenge, engage industry experts like DAC, Patient Recruitment Services, as early as possible, even as early as protocol development, to help successfully navigate those uncharted therapeutic areas, or if you're going to unfamiliar countries that you've selected for the trial, really ensure that you partner with someone who does know how to navigate those waters very easily and well. All right, so as we go to pitfall number 6, those are surrounded around investigator and site relations. Just as real estate professionals consider location, and then the location as the top 3 most important attributes of their success, I would say that clinical trial world would have the top 3 success predictors as site relations, and then maybe secondly site relations, and thirdly site relations, and of course in that order. there is no substitute for intimately knowing and understanding your sites. This knowledge comes predominantly by listening and a proactive time investment with study staff. Having a specialist that can really utilize and that it has those soft skill sets to cultivate and maintain site relations is crucial. Additionally, this person should be amply educated enough to respond to investigator, scientific, and protocol procedural concerns and know when to involve the study team as appropriate. CRAs are great at analyzing data against source and ensuring compliance on what seems to be millions of data points. But when it comes to building relationships with PIs and coordinators, frankly, this is normally secondarily on their list. They have so many other tasks to get done in the short period of time that they are on site. So, as a sponsor or CRO, consider having trained specialists similar to a research-oriented MSL to keep the lines of communication open and flowing. Find those personalities who like and want to know the PI and their staff personally that want to build long-term relationships with the sites. I know it goes without saying, but pay your sites fairly and on time. Nothing strains PI relationships more than not paying market value, first of all, or secondly, paying sites late and they have to rely on lines of credit to pay their research employees while waiting for sponsors 90-plus days for the payments to come through. There are software systems that are commercially available to identify appropriate payments globally based on medical procedures and coding, which can provide guidance on appropriate site payments. As I think over my clinical trial career, I've experienced surprises during several of my past studies with investigators going on a 3-month sabbatical, for example, or a 1-month vacation during a very crucial time in the study. Have a backup plan available, which includes, number 1, sub-investigators for all selected TIs. You'd be surprised how many sponsors still refuse to get a sub-investigator involved on trials. And make sure that those sub-investigators can provide equivalent care to research patients, which should be, which should the PI become unavailable during the study conduct period. And secondly, of course, have backup sites. And 5 to 10% extra sites, depending on the size of your study, is probably adequate. But if you have a really small trial, you might, consider having a few more just to have in your back pocket if for some reason the sites need to be closed or if a site needs to be replaced. Discuss the time out of the clinic with PIs and staff, which also includes those academy meetings and industry conferences at the time of feasibility. This establishes early and reasonable expectations for enrollment and site performance before a site is selected. Investigators are human, and they experience illness, unfortunately, and sometimes even tragedy and death during their studies. So be prepared. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, and make sure you have a contingency plan. Mid-study or periodic rejuvenation meetings are some of the most powerful ways to maintain study momentum. In fact, at DAC, we have worked with a multitude of sponsors and have benefited from site training focused on recruitment and retention of their research subjects. Consider budgeting for those rejuvenation-type meetings up front to keep your study top of mind with the study coordinators and the PIs, and to help maintain site motivation, especially for those really long-term, multi-year studies. And as a reminder, if you find that more than 3 months elapsed from the time of site selection to study initiation, I'll reiterate, consider revisiting the critical portions of the feasibility exercise to determine enrollment impact on a particular study. So Dan, now with that, I believe you're going to share with us some ideas on metrics on how to predict high-performing sites.
Thank you, Gwen, for sharing that invaluable information, certainly with your tremendous background and expertise that you have. That came through loud and clear, and we appreciate it. So I wanted to spend some time this slide really just says one thing basically loud and clear, is that when we do a terrific job with our planning, when we get robust data through the feasibility process, when we really plan out our studies correctly, and we get information on that's accurate on the number of patients at sites, and it's accurate on the experience of sites, our data supports that these are the sites that actually end up being successful in a program, and that's just the truth. I mean, I think that the process around collection of the data can be tedious. Certainly, we're all being pushed. We're all under tight timelines, but if hurrying into the study is only going to result in delays later on, more headaches, more frustration, and more cost, then isn't it smart just to take the time up front to do it properly? And that's really what we're stressing, I think, throughout this entire presentation when it comes to global trials. Really have all your ducks in a row, be very thorough and diligent and robust in your data collection process as you try to understand the countries that you're looking at for your trial. You're looking at trying to understand the investigative site landscape, the patient landscape, and really make sure that you get all the information you can so you can make really smart strategic decisions about where to place your program. So the last couple of slides is really our chance to share a case study with you, and would want to walk through one I think that brings out all of the points covered and brings to light sort of the things we've talked about today and a number of the pitfalls that we've walked through with you. Specifically, it brings to light the challenges when conducting a study feasibility analysis in countries which make up a global study, especially when you're a sponsor that's not familiar with operating in those countries. And one of the things we all deal with when we're doing our jobs is trying to make accurate estimates and forecasts, sometimes when working with very limited information. A common example that we experience is when, as service providers, is when we're given a protocol synopsis or a draft protocol and asked to conduct a feasibility analysis or prepare a proposal, as was the situation with this particular case study. And you've got to try to make some estimations that are accurate, but you're not necessarily dealing with the full picture. So this was for a multinational phase 3 ovarian cancer program for a large international pharmaceutical company. And the study was going to take place in 5 countries, including Brazil and India, 2 emerging markets, if you will. So the initial feasibility analysis was conducted using the draft protocol that was provided by the sponsor. And the analysis took place where sites were approached and talked to about the study, and in some cases visited and analyzed as potential sites for the program. And the results of that analysis were actually quite promising to the sponsor. In summary, across 7 to 8 sites in India and Brazil, about 160 to 180 patients could be enrolled over a 10-month period from a pool of about 500 plus highly qualified or pre-qualified patients at those investigative sites that were coming through on a monthly basis. The sites that were included as part of the feasibility analysis were made up of large public government-funded sites and also large private hospitals and oncology centers. Also, the program manager of the sponsor had never visited the countries, so there was a plan for the program manager to come out and visit with the sites and review them in person and sort of kick the tires, if you will. Before that actually happened, and as part of sort of a next phase, the sponsor provided the finalized protocol, or at least a much more advanced copy of the protocol. And upon review of the protocol and analysis of the information now included, there were several additional factors which came to light which weren't previously known. Things like the subjects must have completed second-line chemotherapy and be platinum-resistant. The subjects were required to take home the study drug, which was going to require temperature controls to keep it under the right temperature, both during transportation and at the study site. and at the patient's home. And also the subjects were going to be required to complete a specialized quality of life questionnaire. So if we go to the next slide, we'll sort of take you through what kind of happened as a result of these additional details coming to light with regards to the protocol. So in addition to the challenges that I just mentioned, the trial manager from the sponsor had never before traveled to these countries and was somewhat naive to some of the unique sensory elements of daily life and unfamiliar with the range of research settings. During her visit to the country, she toured several state-of-the-art private research clinics, and she also toured large public government-funded hospitals. The private institutions certainly had a familiar feel to her in that they looked like clinics found in more mature markets, such as Europe and North America. But by contrast, the government centers were big and noisy institutions with a large number of patients. And she was not familiar with that particular setting. But interestingly enough, the government-funded centers are the ones that are actually filled with some of the country's top investigators, including those that were part of U.S. FDA and EMA INDs and NDA submissions. Also, the patients visiting government hospitals were eligible for free treatment as part of the country's social health care setting. So therefore, these institutions receive a much higher volume of patients. So as a result, the initial feasibility analysis that was conducted included a significant number of patients coming from those centers. But there are additional challenges that emerged as we looked at the more robust protocol, and we took into account the socioeconomic status of patients that were the ones that were seen at the government hospitals. There were things like the fact that the study drug had to be transported to the patient's home under controlled temperature requirements, that had to be stored in the patient's home under similar requirements. In both of those cases, we often found that the socioeconomic climate and patients that were being seen at the government centers were not going to really qualify for the program simply because there was no way to keep the study drug, or no way to at least verify that the study drug was kept at the right temperature, because often these patients didn't have refrigerators in their home, didn't have air conditioning, and were sort of immediately deemed ineligible simply because we couldn't confirm that. There were also things like the diagnosis was poor in some cases. In other cases, the patients couldn't even afford first-line chemotherapy, let alone second-line chemotherapy. And one of the unique elements of the government centers that we were looking at was that while health care was free of charge as part of the social health care setting, the chemotherapy was not free of charge and would often require payment. So the ability to identify patients that had completed second-line chemotherapy became very difficult as well. Last but not least, there was a quality of life questionnaire, as I mentioned. And these were things that had to be translated and validated in those countries, which is going to require a tremendous amount of time and be costly. And that also had to be taken into consideration with regards to the timelines around activation of sites and getting these countries up and running. And I'd say last but not least, the private centers for the sponsor and the sponsor representative were definitely more aesthetically appealing. There was a comfort level there because of the level of familiarity with the setting when compared to settings they were used to in North America and Europe. So that also impacted their decision, and ultimately they decided to only go with private-type centers on this program. So as you can imagine, that had a significant impact on the feasibility analysis in the program overall. Where previously we were looking at 5 countries on the study, the sponsor ended up ultimately having to expand the program into 12 countries. They ultimately reduced the number of sites in Brazil and India from 7 to 6, and the patient pool available at those sites dropped off dramatically when applying the additional information we knew about the protocols. We went from over 500 potentially eligible patients per month to 95 to 100 potentially eligible patients. And we also went from 160 to 180 estimated enrollment at those sites to only 60 to 70 patients. So this case study really brings to light all the details and potential pitfalls that you can run into when trying to plan a program that's going to have other countries involved and sites involved across the world. And certainly there's a lot of planning that has to take place, and you really have to be working from a completed protocol, real solid confidence on what your study looks like before you can really go forward with an accurate feasibility analysis in those countries. So So we hope that the information that we shared with you today was useful, is information that you feel is actionable. As you can tell by the style of the slides and the layout of the information, this is almost sort of a checklist type of approach that we followed here, but we do hope that these are things that you can take back to your job and apply in a real-world setting on a day-to-day basis, and they're certainly based on our real-world experience doing our jobs every day, supporting sponsors with their site selection, recruitment, and retention programs and clinical trials. And with that, I'd like to turn it over back to the moderator, Melinda, and open the floor up for any questions you might have.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you, Gwen. Information that you've presented today has been great, and I definitely think there's some good information and that people can take away and then actually execute and implement as they're considering how to set up a global clinical trial. So I would like to open it up to those of you in attendance. If you have any questions, again, I would ask that you please put those into the chat box there at the lower right-hand corner of your control panel. So I'll take a look here to see if we have any questions that have come in. So just give me a minute. Okay, thanks. It looks like a question just popped up. And Dan, I'm going to put this one to you as it deals with the site identification process. And the question is, it says, while in the U.S. the site identification process has become more sophisticated and data-driven, it seems that the information available on international sites is still a bit of a black hole. Are you aware of resources or techniques being used to find good international sites?
Great, thank you. That's a terrific question, and certainly it's still a bit of a challenge when it comes to finding sites internationally and really making good selections of sites. But there's some things that we do and some expertise that we can apply based on our years of experience, and that has proven to be effective. And I think certainly there's no magic bullets. There's no one database or thing that we turn to, but instead there's really a multifaceted type of a program that we'd like to put in place when it comes to a site identification outside the U.S. There's several points that I'd like to make here. First and foremost, nothing beats past experience with sites. And while it's not a guarantee of future success, it certainly helps eliminate some of the risk compared to finding entirely new sites. So we like to consider that first. Second, we often look at site networks or site management organizations for support when those exist in a particular country, because we found that these organizations not only have strong relationships with their sites, but they also have very rich data on the patient populations at the sites, the facilities and the capabilities of the sites, and they can save considerable time during the feasibility and contracting process due to their really centralized operating structure. And I'd say last but not least, we have unique access internally here at DAC to some robust international investigative databases developed by our market intelligence partners, and we can leverage those and the collated information that they put together from public trial registries, government investigator registrations like the 1572 we have here in the U.S., professional journals, and more as part of a rich data set on each investigator's level of expertise and experience in clinical research. So in short, often it's a combination of approaches that we found works best. Next, is there any other questions that come in?
No, thanks, Dan. That was great. I appreciate it. While you were giving that response, we did have another question that came in. And so, Gwen, I'd like to put this one over to you, if I may. It says that I'm conducting a global study and would like to provide sites with recruitment support. How do I know which type of initiatives are approvable or are approvable in a particular country?
Oh, Melinda, that's a question we hear very often, isn't it? Dan, I know you're shaking your head as well. We hear that very often because it's difficult to know from a study team perspective of what kind of mix or what kind of services is really going to resonate well with the patient population in a certain country. And so my advice to you is, number one, really partner with someone who does know. As you probably know, DAC Patient Recruitment Services has worked in over 100 countries in the last 20 years we've been in business. We also work in over 40 therapeutic areas. So that being said, we would love to partner with you and help you to navigate that. Just know that really there's not a lot of regulatory requirements, or there's not a lot of regulatory stipulations, I would say. It's really more based on the patient population you're seeking and the cultural and local adoption of the particular way you want to reach out to patients. So you need to have that intel and really go after the patients in a way that best suits their lifestyles and the way that they are used to getting information very comfortably. And that's one thing that we've found, that, by going to those countries and using the right modes that really resonate well with those patients in country, we've had a lot of success. And we'd like to share that with you as well if any of you have any particular questions or need some assistance in finding patients internationally. We definitely have an expertise in that area.
Great. Thank you so much, Gwen. I appreciate that. Let me take a quick look here and see if we have any questions left to be answered. And that looks like that was the last question that we have received. So with that, I will close out this webinar. I want to thank each and every one of you for participating today. You'll see at the screen that there is both Dan and Gwen's contact information, so I would absolutely welcome you to reach out to them should you have any other questions that might come to mind following this presentation. Also, immediately following the presentation, you will be receiving a follow-up email from us that will contain a link that will take you to the slide deck that we've presented here, as well as accompanied by a recording of the presentation. So again, thank you very much for your time, and please feel free to join us for future webinars. Thank you.